All right, today we're going to continue our story of Daniel by looking at chapter 5, verse 30 through the end of chapter 6. The story of Daniel in the lion's den was to rank right up there among the top 10 well-known Bible stories of all time. In fact, many people who have never read the Bible know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Churches today tend to only tell this story to children to show them how important it is to stay faithful to God like Daniel did. And that's fine, nothing wrong with that, but the whole story has to, what it has to say applies to old people too. Senior citizens need to hear this story just as much as children do. That way they won't forget that people are never too old to stand up for what's right. When we first met Daniel, he was probably in his early teens. Daniel began his life in Judah as a member of the nobility. He was living in the land that God had promised to give his ancestors. God told Abraham that the land that was to become known as Israel would belong to his descendants as long as they continued to serve him. The problem was they really never served him. So after many generations of disloyalty, God's patience finally ran out and he took that land away from them. Well, the first thing that God did was to allow the Assyrians to destroy the northern kingdom, which was still called Israel. Then a few hundred years later, he allowed Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, to capture the southern kingdom known as Judah. Well, Nebuchadnezzar actually attacked Jerusalem 3 different times. The first time he captured Jerusalem, he did not destroy it. Instead, he set up a puppet government there, and then he took the best and the brightest of Israel's people back to Babylon with him. And by doing that, he figured that there wouldn't be anyone in Israel that would be smart enough to lead a revolt against him. His plan was to turn them into good Babylonians. And then he was going to use their knowledge of the Jewish culture to advise him about how best to control the Jewish captives. He also took away any craftsmen that could make weapons. He figured that by doing that, the Jews wouldn't have the weapons needed to oppose him. So Daniel suddenly found himself taken from his home and forced to serve a pagan king in Babylon. And as a result, a whole lot of changes take place. Step 1 in Daniel's training was they changed his Hebrew name to a Chaldean name, so Daniel became Belteshazzar, and they changed the language to Chaldean, and his homeland became Babylon. But they could never change his heart. And since Daniel remained faithful to God in spite of his circumstances, God blessed Daniel for it. And the wisdom that God had given to Daniel was far greater than the wisdom of anybody else in the kingdom. Well, since God had given Daniel the ability to interpret dreams, he actually ended up being the chief advisor to the king. Well, Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, and his son Amel-Marduk became king. But 2 years later, he was murdered by his brother-in-law, Nergal-Sharezer. Now, no one really knows for sure what happened to Nergal-Sharezer, but there was some ancient writings that talk about a war that he was involved in between 557 and 556 BC. And since his son, Labashi-Marduk, assumed the throne in 556 BC, speculation is that he was killed in that war. Well, when Labashi-Marduk became king, he was a very young boy. So 9 months after he became the king of Babylon, a group of conspirators that were being led by a man named Nabonidus decided they were going to seize power, so they killed Labashi-Marduk and they put Nabonidus on the throne. Well, Nabonidus wasn't really a Babylonian, he was an Assyrian. He probably justified his claim to the throne by reminding people that he married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter Nitocris. So this made him Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. The fact that Nitocris happened to be King Nergal-Sharezer's widow didn't hurt either. Well, Daniel's reputation as a very wise man preceded him, so he ended up advising every one of those kings. But through all the years and through all those pagan kings, Daniel never compromised his faith in God. Now here's the problem. Daniel says that Belshazzar was king, but the historical record says that Nabonidus was king. Critics of the Bible always love to point out this is just another proof that the Bible is nothing more than a work of fiction. But today we know that the Bible is 100% accurate, and here's why Daniel was right. In 553 BC, Nabonidus became obsessed with the worship of the moon god Sin. So he took an extended leave of absence from his duties as king, and he went off to stay at the oasis of Tamia. It seems that there was a temple to the moon god there, and Nabonidus dedicated himself totally to the worship of the moon. Well, when Nabonidus left, he appointed his son Belshazzar as co-regent and put him in charge of the kingdom. So even though Nabonidus was still officially the king, for all intents and purposes, Belshazzar was ruling the kingdom since he was the acting king anytime Nabonidus wasn't around. And Nabonidus stayed in Tamia for 13 years. Well, in 540 BC, Nabonidus caught wind that the Persians were going to try to take over Babylon. So he returned to Babylon in order to lead the defense of the country. Even then, he only stayed in Babylon long enough to gather the army together, and then he went off to fight the Persians. This left Belshazzar in charge of defending the city of Babylon. And this brings us to another very familiar story in the Bible. The year is 539 BC, and since Nabonidus is still off chasing the Persians, Belshazzar is still in charge of defending Babylon. Now, since the walls of Babylon were actually made up of 3 walls with a total thickness of over 60 feet, they were thought to be impregnable. So Belshazzar feels pretty safe inside the city. In fact, he didn't see any need to really post a guard on the wall. Then, on October 12th of the year 539 BC, he decides to throw himself a birthday party. But he does something really stupid. He decides to mock the God of Israel by using the cups and the utensils that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem to serve food and adult beverages to the party guests. And God is not very pleased by that. So during the party, the hand of God appears in the banquet hall, and he writes the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson on the wall. Well, at this point, Daniel is approaching the end of his career. He's probably in his late 90s by now, or rather his late 80s. So most likely he's semi-retired. So when none of the current wise men could tell Belshazzar what the words on the wall meant, Belshazzar's mother, Nitocris, remembers Daniel and suggests that they call on him. Well, when Daniel arrives in the banquet hall, Belshazzar offers Daniel a promotion if he can tell him what those words mean. He says that he will make Daniel the 3rd ruler in the kingdom if he can interpret what the hand wrote on the wall. And here's what Daniel says. Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he kept alive, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he raised up, and whom he would he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the heaven vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and the lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hands is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, before you ask, there's a few discrepancies in that passage that I need to clear up. First, this passage says that Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father, but history shows that Nabonidus was his father. Well, remember, with a few minor exceptions, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And there is no word in the Hebrew language for grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on. So there are many cases where the word father is used in the same way that we would use the words forefather or ancestor, and this is one of them. Nebuchadnezzar was actually Belshazzar's maternal grandfather. His mother was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Nitocris. This custom was also carried over into the New Testament as well. That's why you'll see Jesus referred to as the son of David occasionally, because in the human sense, Jesus was a descendant of David. Second, the word Perez in verse 28 is simply the plural form of the word parson in verse 25. Also notice that Belshazzar made Daniel the third ruler of the kingdom. You see, he couldn't make Daniel the second ruler of the kingdom because he was number 2. Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, was still officially the king. But for all intents and purposes, Belshazzar had been ruling Babylon as co-regent for at least the last 14 years. So third place was the best position that he could offer to Daniel. Well, here's how Babylon fell. First, Belshazzar was depending on the Babylonian army to defend the city. He didn't know that the Persians had defeated the Babylonian army 2 days earlier, and Nabonidus had been forced to run for his life. Second, as strong as the walls of Babylon were, there was one major flaw in the design that had been overlooked. The water supply for the city came from the Euphrates River, and that river actually flowed under the wall. Even so, they were still felt safe because they had built a very heavy iron gate under the wall of the city to block the opening where the river entered. And no one was able to hold their breath long enough to swim to the gate and destroy it and then walk into the city. But there was one thing that they had not counted on. They assumed that there would always be water flowing in that river. But the Persian general had his men build a dam upstream, and they dug a trench to divert the water into a nearby marsh. This lowered the water level in the river to the point where it was only about knee-deep. So the soldiers could very easily wade up to the wall without having to hold their breath. This allowed them enough time to knock down the iron gate that blocked the opening to the city. Then the Persian army would simply walk in under the wall. Well, in verse 31, we're told that the guy who was leading the Persian army was called Darius the Mede. So who is this Darius the Mede? Well, Darius the Mede is another biblical figure that seems to be lost to history. And critics of the Bible just love to point this out as another one of the errors in the Bible. Well, first off, we don't want to confuse this Darius with the other kings named Darius that are mentioned in other parts of the Bible. The second thing to look at is whether Darius is a proper name or a title. It literally means holder of the scepter. And there were many kings that were called Darius. Personally, I think it's a title. It was used sort of like Caesar or Herod. It probably started out as a person's name, but was used later as a title. The fact is, the history records 5 kings that were all called Darius, even though they had other names as well. But that still doesn't tell us who this particular Darius is. Well, at the time, the king of Persia was a man named Cyrus. Cyrus was the son of Cambyses I, who was the king of Anshan, which was in Media. He was also the grandson of Astyages, who was the last king of Media. So how did the Median prince become a king of Persia? I'm glad you asked. It seems that shortly after Cyrus was born, his grandfather, Astyages, had a dream that his advisors interpreted to mean that his grandson was going to depose him someday. So he tries to have his infant grandson killed. But instead of killing Cyrus, the man who was supposed to kill him raised him as his own son. Well, when Cyrus's father Cambyses died in 559 BC, Cyrus was made king of Anshan, which would become the capital of the Persian Empire. And maybe his grandfather didn't put 2 and 2 together and realized that this was the same Cyrus that he had tried to kill, or he just ignored him. My guess is that Cyrus was operating under an alias at the time, and his grandfather didn't realize that he was the same person that he had tried to kill earlier. Well, Cyrus wasn't very happy about having to answer to the king of Media. I mean, you see, there was no love lost between Cyrus and the king of Media, because the king of Media was the grandfather that had tried to kill him when he was a baby. So, in 549 BC, Cyrus took the Persian army, and he rebelled against his father, and he defeated him. But when Cyrus assumed the throne, instead of taking the title King of the Medes, he assumed the throne as the king of Persia, and the Medo-Persian Empire was born. So, in Persia, he was called Cyrus the Great, and in Media, he was Darius the Mede. So, depending on where you lived, Cyrus the Great and Darius the Mede were the same person. Well, some of the confusion comes from the fact that there was another Darius the Mede referred to here, and his real name was Gubaru. And Gubaru was the general who was in charge of that part of the Medo-Persian army that first entered Babylon. Well, ancient records have been found that said that Gubaru was born in 601 BC. So that would have made him 62 years old when Babylon was captured. And when Cyrus went back to Persia, he appointed Gubaru as the ruler of Babylon. So for all intents and purposes, he became the new king of Babylon. And as the holder of the scepter, at least for as far as the Babylonians were concerned, he would have assumed the title of Darius the Mede as well. Now, back in those days, whenever a general had a victory, the king would always take the credit. So even though Gubaru may have been in charge of the Persian army that captured Babylon while Cyrus was off chasing Nabonidus, Cyrus would have still gotten credit for the victory. But there is a problem here too. Daniel says that Darius was 62 years old when he took over Babylon. And assuming that he was really born in 601 BC, that would make Gubaru 62 years old when Babylon fell. But Cyrus was supposed to have been born in 590 BC. That would have made him 11 years younger than Gubaru. So if the king was the one who was always given credit for the victory, Daniel must have violated protocol and given Gubaru the credit. And if that's true, Daniel was simply giving credit where credit was due. Also, we can't really use Gubaru's age as proof that he was also Darius the Mede, and here's why. Apparently, Daniel did not know exactly how old Darius was when he wrote this account. Remember what Daniel said in verse 31. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And most Bible translations do show it that way. Now, it's a good possibility that Cyrus may have looked a little older than he really was, or maybe we've got his birthday wrong. As I was doing my research for this lesson, I found biographies of Cyrus the Great that put his birthday somewhere between 580 BC and 605 BC. And since he had to be kept hidden during his childhood, nobody would have written down very much about him. And in order to hide his identity, they may have purposely recorded his birthday wrong. Besides, every record of his birth would have been destroyed by his grandfather in order to cover up the murder. It's also possible that they may have passed him off as being younger than he really was, so that his grandfather wouldn't suspect that he was the same grandson that he had tried to murder. So there's no way for us to really tell exactly when Cyrus the Great was born. After all, most people didn't even know that he existed for most of his life. And everyone who didn't know thought he was dead. So he may have actually began his early 60s when Babylon was defeated. We just don't know that for sure. Well, at least for the first few years of Babylon was defeated, Cyrus and Gubaru were both in the city. You see, after Cyrus had defeated Nabonidus ran to Babylon for protection. He thought that the fancy wall would have kept the Persians out. He didn't realize that the city had already fallen to the Persians. That's when Cyrus finally caught up with him. So Cyrus may have arrived in Babylon at about the same time that Gubaru captured the city. Then he stayed there for a while until the new government was organized. And then he went back home and left Gubaru in charge. At that point, Gubaru would have also assumed the title of Darius, the holder of the scepter. Now, I want you to notice something else in verse 31 of chapter 5. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom. This was probably referring to General Gubaru. You see, Guburu was the regional governor and a military leader. He was not in line to be king of anything. So he didn't inherit the throne of Babylon. He received the kingdom from Cyrus, but Cyrus inherited his crown from his father. This is one of the more reasons I think, at least in this passage, two different people actually held the title of Darius the Mede. Another reason I think that Darius the Mede also refers to Cyrus the Great is found in verse 1. As a general, Guburu would not have taken it upon himself to totally overhaul the Babylonian government. And notice that verse 1 of chapter 6 says that Darius set these satraps, which were regional leaders, throughout the whole kingdom. So in this case, we have to be dealing with much more than just a regional governor. But since Cyrus was the king, he had every right to do that. All right, look at verses 1 and 2. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps would give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. As soon as King Cyrus looked at how things were organized in Babylon, he could see that there were many opportunities for corruption to occur in the government. And he suspects that the government officials that he inherited from Belshazzar weren't exactly honest. So he sets out to plug the holes where his wealth could be leaked out into the pockets of these corrupt officials. He decides to appoint 120 regional rulers known as satraps, and he gave them the job to make sure that the officials that they were to oversee weren't stealing from him. Then he puts 3 high officials over them, and one high official for every 40 satraps. So the local guys were being watched by these 120 satraps. And then the satraps were being watched by these 3 high officials. And Cyrus hoped that this would put a stop to the corruption that was running rampant under the Babylonian system. Well, as he is interviewing people for the position of high official, he hears about how Daniel had predicted that the Persians were going to defeat the Babylonians. So he appoints Daniel to be one of the 3 high officials. But it isn't long before Daniel's ability and honesty start to get noticed, and the king wants to give him a promotion. Look at verse 3. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Well, this doesn't set too well with the other 2 high officials or the 120 satraps. After all, Daniel was getting very close to being 9 years old. He was supposed to be retired, and besides that, he was a Jew. How could the king possibly promote a Jewish captive over them? After all, wasn't Daniel supposed to be a slave, not the prime minister of the whole country? So verse 4 says, Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. They were determined to find something that in Daniel's life that they could use to discredit him in the eyes of the king. In other words, they were trying to find some skeletons in Daniel's closet. You see, the politics of personal destruction that you see going on in this country today have been around for a long time. Well, these were the guys who were supposed to make sure that the flow of resources went to Darius. But they were doing their level best to get as much of it as they could for themselves. I've always wondered why white-collar crooks don't use their business skills honestly. I mean, if they did, they'd be much more successful in the long run. But they seem to always be willing to risk everything on some dishonest scheme that they only get them a short-term gain and will ultimately land them in jail. But Daniel was just too honest. These crooked bureaucrats knew that he wouldn't go along with their scheme. They also knew that he was a competent manager who would eventually catch them in their dishonesty. So they set out to make sure that Daniel wouldn't get the job as prime minister. All right, look back at verse 4. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. You know, Daniel was a really amazing individual. He was absolutely squeaky clean. They could not dig up any dirt on him at all. They tried their best, but they couldn't find anything bad about Daniel. Daniel was incorruptible. In other words, they couldn't find anything that he was doing that he shouldn't be doing, and they couldn't find anything that he didn't do that he should have been doing. Now, I would venture a guess that every one of us has something in our past that we would rather not have people know about. But see, that didn't apply to Daniel. His life was an open book. He was like Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way. So his enemies have to come up with a different plan. Well, these guys get together, and here's what they come up with. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." That is amazing. Daniel's life was so pure and unmarked by corruption that these guys are forced to conclude that the only fault that Daniel has is that he is totally committed to his God. Friends, if you are living your life in such a way that the only thing that your enemies can say about you is that you are totally sold out to your God, you are fulfilling the New Testament principle of suffering for righteousness' sake. So, they searched high and low, and the only thing they could say about Daniel was that he was totally sold out to God. And the only way that they could ever hope to bring him down was to put him in a position where he had to choose between obeying the king or obeying God, because they knew that he would choose to obey God. What a commendation of Daniel's character. Well, the people who refuse to serve God will always be opposed to the people who love God and faithfully serve him. You see, unbelievers will never think that they're being discriminated. They will always think that they're being discriminated against by believers. Unbelievers will very often oppose believers simply because they live the lives of true believers lead, will always be in sharp contrast to the sinful lives that unbelievers lead. And that is always a source of guilt and conviction for them. So even if a believer doesn't flaunt his beliefs, the integrity that he displays in his life will automatically be resented by the people who live otherwise. That's why unbelievers promote evolution today. They've turned evolution into their religion. Chance is their God. Evolution is their theology. The schools are their temples. Abortion is their sacrament. The teachers are their priests. And questioning it is blasphemy. And that's why they try so hard to eliminate God from the public square. You see, in their minds, if they can remove God from the public view, they will also be able to remove any obligation they may have to obey him. And that would leave them free to do whatever they want to do. But God's law won't go away just because men decide to eliminate it from their lives. Well, Daniel had done nothing to warrant their hatred, but Daniel's integrity made the lack of integrity stand out like a Big Mac in a health food store. And they resented him for it. But rather than coming to Christ and trying to live a holy lives themselves, unbelievers will try to destroy believers. This is why the secular media will squeal with glee whenever they can report that a professing Christian has been caught up in something illegal. When was the last time you read a newspaper headline to say an accountant for H&R Block had been arrested for shoplifting? But if a Christian minister gets caught shoplifting, the fact that he is a Christian minister will be in big bold letters on the front page of the newspaper. You see, it gives them comfort to be able to show to the world that Christians are no better than they are. And that seems to ease their consciences a little bit. You see, they don't understand that not all professing Christians are really true Christians. They forget that Christians are never presented as being perfect, they're just forgiven. And they're in the process of being perfected. Well, here's what these guys do. Look at verse 6. And then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." Remember, that's something you have to say to kings. It kind of strokes their egos. Even Daniel would say the same thing from the lion's den a little bit later. Look at verse 7. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, all agree. Now that was a lie, because Daniel was just reporting what they said. They didn't all meet together, but for one thing, Daniel wasn't there and he was their boss. That was a plot that was being put together by a handful of malcontents that were trying to convince the king that everybody had agreed with their proposal. Oh, here's what they asked the king to do. They say, "We all agree that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions." There was an old quiz show that was aired between 1956 and 1964 that was called Queen for a Day. Well, they should call this a God for a month. They go to the king and say, "King, we all got together and we all agreed that you are worthy of being our God for 30 days. So we want you to issue a decree that says that anyone who prays to another God during this time should be thrown into the lions." Now, if you think that you can elect your God and that you can only be your God for 30 days, you're dealing with some pretty screwed up theology. And any God who can be removed from office after 30 days can't be much of a God. Well, in those days, the gods that the pagans worshiped were modeled after men. In other words, if you study the ancient gods of mythology, you'll see that they were just as flawed as the people are. The only thing that differentiated people from their gods was the fact that the gods were supposed to be immortal, but their gods were just as immoral as they were. To us, saying that a man could be a god is absolutely ludicrous, because we can see that the true God is absolutely holy and absolutely perfect. But that wasn't the problem with these guys. You see, if you go back and look at ancient history, you'll see that the Romans thought that the Caesars were gods. The Egyptians thought that the pharaohs were gods. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids and even the Herods claimed to be gods. So it wasn't unusual for the ancient world for a monarch to decide to invent a new god. And sometimes the new god on the block was them. Well, they had hit Darius right in his ego. He was flattered to think that all the rulers and wise men of the kingdom had actually thought enough of him to want to worship him. They had used Darius' ego to dupe him into thinking that they were all sincere about this and had no ulterior motive at all. So in verse 8, these guys make a suggestion. "Now, O king, establish an injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Now, we don't know a whole lot about the law of the Medes and the Persians, but we do know this. Once the king had issued a written decree, it could not be repealed or violated for a fixed period of time. Even the king himself had to obey his own written decrees. That's one reason why these guys insisted that a particular decree was to expire after 30 days. Now, historians think that they did this as a way in order to prevent the king from passing a lot of frivolous laws. In other words, since the law couldn't be repealed, the hope was the king would really think twice before he put a decree in writing. So their laws always had an expiration date. That way, all laws could be reviewed every now and then, and if there was a bad law, they could be just let it expire. And the good laws, they could be reinstated. So verse 9 says that in the emotion of the moment, therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. Well, word gets back to Daniel that this new law has been enacted, and notice what he does. It's in verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to the house where they had windows in the upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Many years earlier, when Daniel was a young Jewish captive being trained for the life of service in the Babylonian government, he had resolved to be faithful to God regardless of the consequences, and God had honored that devotion. And here we are about 70 years later, and Daniel is facing another threat coming from the very men that he had served beside in the court of the Persian king. Remember what I said earlier, people who do not honor God will always oppose those who do. So if you have never met with any sort of criticism or opposition as a result of the way you live your life, maybe a time to reevaluate your relationship with God. And Paul told us to do that every now and then. He wrote, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves, or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test?" Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not telling you to go around making yourself obnoxious in order to get them to oppose you. We are to do what Peter said. "For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name." Well, they had passed a law that made it illegal for Daniel to pray to God. But Daniel went to his house, opened the windows that faced Jerusalem, and he prayed to God 3 times a day, just like he always did. And of course, these guys knew that is exactly what Daniel was going to do. So even before the ink was dry on the king's decree, they made a beeline for Daniel's house. And in verse 11, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. You see, the only person that they wanted to catch disobeying the king's decree was Daniel. So they weren't interested in watching anybody else. That's why they all went to Daniel's house. Now, this raises a question. Why in the world did Daniel go home and open his windows and pray to God 3 times a day? I mean, wasn't that a stupid thing to do? He knew that he would be arrested if he did it. So why did he pray with the windows? Why didn't he pray with the windows closed? That way no one could see him. Why didn't he just lay low for 30 days and pray silently as he walked around? I mean, that way no one would know what he was doing. But you see, any compromise at all would have been seen as an admission that Daniel's God wasn't able to protect him. And it wasn't in his character to do that. So Daniel continued doing what he always did. He demonstrated perseverance. What a truly virtuous and godly man he was. But remember, any believer who knows how to kneel and pray before the Lord will have no trouble at all standing up in the strength of the Lord to face adversity. Well, these guys are ecstatic. They think that they have finally found the evidence that they need to get rid of Daniel. They won't have to worry anymore that Daniel might discover their corruption and report them to the king. Look at verses 12 and 13. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? Notice that they're making it sound as though the whole thing was the king's idea. They had him personally affirm that he was going to enforce that decree that he signed that made him God for a month. And Darius took the bait. The king answered and said, the thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Well, now that they're sure that the king has no choice but to enforce his decree, they spring the trap. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you signed, but it makes his petition 3 times a day. Now, when they said that Daniel paid no attention to the king, they were lying again. Daniel regarded the king in the way that God's word prescribed. He rendered unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. He was a loyal and faithful servant of the king, as long as that loyalty didn't cause him to violate God's word. But because of Daniel's integrity, the people who had no integrity at all were opposing him. And notice that these guys make sure to point out that fact that Daniel was one of the exiles from Judah. Look over here, O king, that Bible thumper is thumbing his nose at you. And you must be willing to suffer that same kind of persecution. Never compromise your integrity to placate people who have no integrity. And far too many Christians are doing that today. Unbelievers have convinced us that openly practicing our faith is offensive to them. And since we don't want to offend anybody, we keep our faith hidden from the view so that no one will criticize us. But never forget what Jesus said. So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. If you are ashamed to publicly acknowledge that you know Christ, he will be ashamed to acknowledge that he knows you. If you're hiding your faith in order to keep the world happy, your efforts are very misguided. But never forget this. You need to keep God happy and not worry about what the unbelievers in the world think of you. When are we going to stop catering to the 1% of people who are offended by everything and start listening to the 99% of people who aren't? Well, Darius' ego was what got him to sign that decree. He made him God for a month. And before the day was over, he realized that the people had made a fool of him. Look at verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. The New King James Version translates that verse a little bit better. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the sun, going down to the sun to deliver him. The word that the ESV translates as distress is the Chaldean word biash. It refers to something that really stinks. Well, Darius realized that the decree that he had issued, making himself God for a month, really stinks. And he was mad at himself for allowing these guys to talk him into doing something that was that stupid. I mean, after all, they were being paid to prevent him from doing stupid things. Well, it was customary for the Persians to carry out executions before the day was over. This gave Darius the rest of the day to find a loophole that would save Daniel. So Darius tells his lawyers to get to work and find some way that will allow him to ignore the decree. And his lawyers start poring over the law books. Become sundown, they still have not found a way to get out of this mess. So in verse 15, these guys show up at sundown to remind the king of that fact. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, and no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." There's no way out. They're basically telling the king, you made this law, and now you have to enforce it. You must execute Daniel. Now notice that we don't hear anything from Daniel while this is going on. Daniel never says a word in his own defense. And what defense could there be? Is he sure of lying and saying that he wasn't praying? There was nothing that Daniel could have said in his own defense. You see, Daniel had done exactly what these men were saying he did. And he didn't say anything. He had placed his confidence in God for so many years that he just trusted God to do the right thing. If he was going to die, that's what God wanted. We also understand that by this time, Zerubbabel had already taken a group of Jews and had returned to Jerusalem to start rebuilding it. And since God had promised to allow the Jews to return to Israel someday, Daniel saw this as a sign of God's faithfulness. So after almost 90 years of relying on God, there was no way that Daniel was going to start compromising now. Not even the threat of execution was going to stop him from faithfully serving the Lord. Well, it appears that Darius has no choice. Look at verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The kings declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." So Daniel was thrown into the den filled with half-starved lions. And they were real lions, folks. There were lions that were purposely kept hungry so that they would act as executioners. And we aren't told exactly how many of them there were, but there must have been a whole bunch of them in there. I've seen pictures that only show about 2 or 3 lions because I guess the artist just got tired of painting lions. But there was a lot more lions than that. In fact, there was enough lions in that den that when we get to verse 24 and Daniel's accusers and their families are thrown into the lion's den, the lions caught them and killed them before they even hit the ground. So we know that there was a whole bunch of very hungry lions in that den. One liberal commentator has suggested that there were only a few old feeble lions in there, and since it was dark, Daniel managed to find a place to hide from them until morning. Now, for him to say that, he had to ignore what happened in verse 24. He also ignored the fact that lions have a very keen sense of smell. And like most cats, their night vision is very good. Trust me, folks, there were a whole bunch of very hungry lions in that den, and there was no way for Daniel to avoid them. Well, to make sure that there was no way for anyone to rescue Daniel, they sealed the entrance of the tomb. Look at verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signets of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. It's also possible that the cave was sealed so that no one could harm Daniel before God had a chance to save him. Now, this lion's den was most likely a cave in the side of a hill with a stone placed over the mouth of it. Then there was a hole that had been cut in the top of the hill that went into the cave. that opening would have had an iron grate over it. We know this is true because the word that is translated den in this passage is the Chaldean word gubi, and gubi means pit. So, what we have here is an underground pit that has a side entrance that was used to allow the keepers to do whatever they needed to do to care for the animals. And the hole in the top was made for condemned prisoners, and that's where they were thrown into the den to be executed. Now I want to go back to verse 16 for a moment and look at what the king says to Daniel. May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. Now where do you think Daniel got the idea that Daniel's God was able to save him? Well, if you were paying any attention at all to our lessons about Daniel, you should know by now that Daniel had been around the king for any length of time at all. The king had already heard messages after message about the God of Israel. Daniel wasn't the type of man to keep his faith a secret. And I have no doubt that Daniel had also told the king about how God had rescued Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace. So Darius knew full well that Daniel's God had the power to save him. Well, Darius is heartbroken. I mean, not only was Daniel a loyal friend, he was a great help in ruling the kingdom. But Darius' ego had gotten Daniel thrown into the lion's den. Look at verse 18. Then the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Darius spent the whole night beating himself on the head for being so stupid as to think that he could promote himself to godhood simply by issuing a royal decree. And I have no doubt that he was furious with the guides who had tricked him into doing it. You see, Darius knew about God, but he didn't really have any faith in God. So he really wasn't sure if Daniel's God had the ability to save him or not. But Daniel understood what Jeremiah had said. Ah, Lord God, it is you who have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arms. Nothing is too hard for you. But he had also had enough faith to let God decide whether he should survive or not. All right, look at verses 19 and 20. Then, at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As soon as there was enough light to see, the king rushes to the lion's den. And when he gets there, he has the stone removed, and he sort of peeks over the edge of the pit, but he doesn't hear anything. So hoping for the best and fearing the worst, as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "Oh, Daniel." In other words, he cried out in an anguished voice, "Daniel, are you in there?" Now, notice what he says about Daniel in the rest of that verse. He calls him a servant of the living God. Now, where do you suppose he heard that phrase? Well, I'll tell you where he heard it. He heard it from Daniel. I have no doubt that Darius had heard a lot about the living God of Israel from Daniel. How much do your believing neighbors know about your God simply because you live in the neighborhood? Then we get to the crux of the question. Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? I think it was a little bit late to be asking that question. I mean, after all, Daniel is in the lion's den. But the real question on the king's mind is, was God able to save Daniel? Then the king hears a voice coming from the den. Look at verse 21. Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever." And personally, I think Daniel was being a little bit sarcastic there. Well, when the king heard those words, he knew that his friend and faithful servant had been spared. He had his answer, yes, God was able. Then Daniel tells the king what had happened. Look at verse 22. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. Well, how many angels did God send? Remember, it only took one angel to kill 185,000 Assyrian soldiers and save Jerusalem. Angels are very powerful creatures. So one would have been more than enough to handle a bunch of lions. Then Daniel finally sets the record straight. They have not harmed me because I was found blameless before him. Now, if you're telling the truth, it isn't bragging. And Daniel wasn't bragging. That was a true statement. Then he adds, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. In other words, oh, by the way, I haven't done anything to hurt you either. The king's decree forbidding prayer had been rejected by heaven. So Daniel was right to disobey that law. And Darius understands this now. And notice that Daniel didn't say anything until he had given God the opportunity to put him through the test. Daniel didn't understand why he was facing this trial, but he understood that whatever happened to him was happening because God had allowed it to happen. After all, Daniel was in his 90s. So he may have thought that God had decided that this was his time to die. Well, he trusted God enough to put his life in his hands in the midst of a bunch of half-starved lions. If God had decided that this was Daniel's time to die, then Daniel was okay with that. But Daniel also understood that God had the ability to save him from the lions if he wanted to. He just left the decision up to God. He was saying, God, I don't know why you're allowing me to be tossed into this lion's den, but I'm sure that you have a reason. Maybe you know something I don't know. Maybe you know of something in my life that isn't right, and this is part of it. Do you have enough faith to do that? Daniel didn't proclaim his innocence until after God had put him to the test. Well, how did he know that he was innocent? Simple, God had a perfect chance to punish Daniel, but he didn't. Daniel waited for God to evaluate his guilt or innocence. Look at verse 23. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. When Daniel was pulled out of the lion's den, he didn't have a scratch on him. And the king's overjoyed. Now remember, Daniel was in his 90s at this point, but he didn't even get a bruise when he fell in the lion's den. Now don't misunderstand this story. Just because you believe in God doesn't necessarily mean that the lions aren't going to eat you. There have been many martyrs throughout history who have been very faithful believers, but they still died at the hands of evil men. The issue is this: do we accept God's will? Do we accept the fact that God knows what he's doing? If he wants us to live, we're going to live. If he wants us to die, we're going to die. The point is this: we need to trust him to make the right choice. But never forget this: what is the worst thing the world can do to you? They can kill you and send you to heaven. Is that a bad thing? If those lions had eaten Daniel, he would have immediately been ushered into paradise, and later on in the presence of God for all of eternity. That is where he is right now. So the worst of the two choices is to continue living in this old sinful world. Well, the king finally understands that the officials who had schemed against Daniel were the ones who were really guilty. They had manipulated him to serve their own agenda, and God's advisors would never do that. So as soon as the king is satisfied that Daniel is safe, he turns his attention to these crooked bureaucrats. Look at verse 24. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. This gives us a real good glimpse at pagan law. The law of the Medes and the Persians said, on account of the guilt of one, all of his kindred must perish. So in those days, if you were convicted of a crime, they would execute your whole family. When God said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, he was trying to eliminate these excessive punishments. You see, God's law says that the punishment must fit the crime. But today there are people who will quote that verse to justify their desire for revenge. But pagan rulers had different ideas. They did not want to leave any remaining family members behind who might try to get revenge on the ruler who had ordered their loved one's death. Now, notice what it says here. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So for the liberal churchmen to say that the only reason that Daniel wasn't eaten by those lions was because the lions were old and feeble or they weren't really hungry is ridiculous. It always amazes me to see the lengths to which some of these liberal Bible teachers, and I use the term very loosely, will go in order to discredit the Bible. I can't help but wonder if they really don't believe what the Bible says, and why they decide to make their living as Bible teachers. But then I always come back to what Paul said. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So there's no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. These lions were not old and feeble at all. In fact, they had enough strength to jump up and grab these people in midair. That alone tells you that Daniel would not have been able to fight them off. And he would not have had enough time to hide from them either. And they were hungry. After all, these lions were hungry enough to eat this large group of people, and there must have been several hundred of them. Look at verses 25 to 27. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. Enduring forever, his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." Now, problem is the Persians continued to worship their own gods. All Darius was really doing was adding God to the God of Israel to the list of acceptable gods to worship. Now, I have no doubt that what happened to Daniel is also what caused the king to kick in a little bit more money to help rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And, by the way, the intellectuals in Persia were known as Magi. So if you have ever wondered how the Magi figured out where that star they saw in the sky might be a sign that marked the birth of a Messiah in Israel, you need look no farther than the God protecting Daniel in the lion's den. You see, Daniel was the chief Magi of the day. Isn't that amazing? The actions of one godly man influenced the entire Medo-Persian Empire. And all he really did was remain faithful to God. And as a result of his faithfulness, Daniel's influence extended all the way to the birth of Christ. So don't ever think that one person can't make a difference because they can. God will see to it that they do. But does Daniel get the credit? No. God gets the credit. Daniel was just there. There is one common thread we see throughout the book of Daniel. It's that God is sovereign over all the earth. Even governments that deny him still have to answer to him. Well, God rewards Daniel once again for his faithfulness. Look at verse 28. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And remember, Darius was his title and Cyrus was his name. Let me say this in closing. The issue of choosing to obey God goes much deeper than simply legal matters. There are many other laws we encounter today that are unwritten. We have the expectations of the culture, the prevailing attitudes of people in the community, peer pressure, the influence of tradition, the pressure coming from other church members to compromise in order to get more people into the church building, and the list goes on and on. Believers have to deal with these kind of things every day. We must choose between the people we want what people want us to do and what God wants us to do. And there is no way for people to know what God wants them to do if they aren't involved in the study of the Bible. Well, whatever the things that people demand of us are morally neutral, we have no problem. But whenever people ask us to violate God's principles, we need to make a decision. And choosing God's way in spite of the popular opinion requires a lot of courage. It also requires enough faith to allow God to defend us no matter what the consequences may be. Daniel didn't know if he would survive in that lion's den or not, but he knew that no matter what the outcome was, God was in charge and God knows what he's doing. We may never have to face a group of hungry lions, but we will face challenges to our faith every day of our lives. And those challenges require us to choose between God and the world. And if we ever hope to overcome those challenges, we need the same devotion to God that Daniel possessed. But don't fall into the trap that the name and claim it prosperity gospel preachers have set for you. Just because we're Christians is no guarantee that we are never going to get hurt. You don't have to read very far into the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts, to see that that is not true. Remember what Jesus said. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would have loved you as its own. But because you are not of the world, I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you. A servant is no greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. And remember what Paul told Timothy. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And Peter wrote, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. Nobody ever said that living for God would be a bed of roses. There are the occasional thorns. But if you're faithful, our reward will be that much greater. In fact, I'd even suggest to you that when you get to heaven one day, you're going to say, gee, I wish I had suffered more for God. Let me leave you today with the words from the Apostle Peter. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good.